My daughter-in-law grabbed the microphone at my retirement party and announced that I should sign my house over to them. Right there in front of 60 people, I said no. So she leaned in close and whispered something that made my blood run cold. I smiled, pulled out my phone, and sent 2 text messages. 40 minutes later, everything she'd built came apart at the seams. I need to back up because this didn't start at the party. It started the night my son came home with flour on his shirt and a look on his face I hadn't seen since he was 9 years old and had just won the science fair. My son. I'll call him by what he's always been to me. Just my boy, my only kid. He dropped into the chair across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Dad, I met someone." He was 31. He'd been focused on his career since his mid-20s. The kind of focus that makes a father proud, but also a little worried. Because you don't want your kid to wake up at 50 wondering where the years went. So when he said those words, I felt something loosen in my chest. Good, I thought. Good for him. Her name was Shauna. She worked at a wine bar in Midtown, the kind of place with Edison bulbs and a chalkboard menu. My son had gone in after a late meeting, ordered something he couldn't pronounce, and she'd laughed at him in a way that he said didn't feel mean. He went back 3 nights in a row before he asked for her number. I met her 6 weeks later. My son brought her to Sunday dinner, which in our house has always been a real thing. Pot of chili or a roast, football on low in the background, the kind of meal that stretches into the evening without anyone noticing. Shanna walked in carrying a bottle of wine that I later looked up online and found cost $42. She set it on the counter like she was doing me a favor. She was pretty in a way that seemed deliberate. Everything about her was calibrated. The way she laughed a beat too late at my jokes, like she was deciding whether they were worth laughing at first. The way she complimented my house by saying, "It's got so much potential." I'd lived in that house for 26 years. My wife, God rest her, had picked out every fixture in that kitchen. The house didn't need potential. It was already something. I didn't say any of that. I passed the bread and asked her about her family, her plans, whether she'd always lived in the city. She answered everything smoothly, the way someone does when they've answered those questions before and learned exactly how much to give away. When she excused herself to use the restroom, my son looked at me the way kids do when they want approval so badly they can't hide it. "She's something right, Dad?" "She seems sharp," I said, which was true. He heard it as a compliment. I let him. The next few months, I paid attention. That's what I do. I spent 34 years as a civil engineer, and the job teaches you to look at what's underneath before you trust the surface. I watched how Shanna behaved when she thought my son wasn't watching her. I noticed that she never offered to help clear the table, not once in a dozen Sunday dinners, but always made a point of admiring something new in the house. The credenza my late wife found at an estate sale, the pair of stickly chairs in the den, my father's pocket watch in the display case in the hallway. She didn't just notice these things, she appraised them. The Sunday they crystallized it for me, she picked up the pocket watch without asking, turned it over in her hand, opened the case. "Is this valuable?" she asked. "It's valuable to me," I said. She set it back down like that was the wrong answer. My son proposed to her in March. He called me from the parking lot of the restaurant right after, still out of breath. I could hear her laughing in the background, high and delighted, and I made myself focus on his voice, the pure happiness in it, and I told him congratulations. I told him she was a lucky woman. I told him I loved him and we'd celebrate soon. Then I sat in my living room in the quiet and thought about what I actually knew. I knew she'd moved to the city from somewhere in Ohio 3 years before she met my son, and that her stories about that time were vague in ways that felt practiced. I knew she'd mentioned twice, casually, once at dinner and once while looking at the backyard, that a house like mine was wasted on one person. I knew she'd asked my son early in their relationship whether I had a pension, and he'd told her yes without thinking anything of it. And she'd asked a follow-up question about the house. He told me about that conversation like it was charming, like she was just being practical. I decided to have them for dinner, a real dinner, not Sunday chili. I'm talking the full thing, the good tablecloth, my wife's china, the standing rib roast I only make for Christmas. I wanted to watch Shanna in a setting where she felt she'd arrived somewhere, because that's when people relax their guard. She arrived 40 minutes early. I hadn't finished setting the table. She walked through my front door, looked around the way a building inspector does, and said, You really should think about updating the trim in here. Natural wood is very on trend right now. The trim was original 1960s woodwork that three different neighbors had told me they envied. Through dinner, she redirected every conversation back to real estate, specifically my real estate. What did I think the house would sell for now? Had I considered downsizing? Did I know that the couple 2 streets over it listed for well over asking? My son ate his roast and kept glancing at me, and I kept my face pleasant and my answers short. And by the time we got to dessert, I had heard enough. After they left, I washed the dishes and thought it through the way I used to think through load calculations, methodically, without emotion, accounting for every variable. Here was what I knew for certain. Shauna was not in love with my son. She was in love with what marrying my son would get her. That's not a guess I made on instinct. That's a conclusion I reached after months of evidence. Here was what I didn't know, whether she was simply opportunistic, or whether there was something more deliberate going on. Opportunistic I could work with. Deliberate was a different problem. I decided to find out. I'm 63 years old. I don't have a private investigator in my contacts. What I have is 34 years of methodical work habits, a retired colleague named Pete, who spent 20 years doing structural assessments and knows every coffee shop within walking distance of every neighborhood in this city, and a nephew who works in IT and has shown me, on more than one occasion, how much you can learn about a person from public social media if you know how to look. I started with her social media. What I found there was the first crack in the foundation. Shanna had an Instagram account that she kept semi-private, but her tagged photos were visible, and in those tagged photos, going back about 14 months, well before she met my son, there was a man. Not in every photo, but in enough. A big, easy smiling guy named Bryce, based on the tags. They'd been at a rooftop bar together, at a wedding as what looked like dates, at a beach house over Labor Day weekend the previous year. The last tagged photo with him was from 4 months ago, 2 months before she got engaged to my son. I didn't make any assumptions. People date. People break up. That alone meant nothing. But Bryce's own profile was public, and on his profile the photos with Shanna hadn't stopped. There was one from 3 weeks ago. They were at what looked like a backyard cookout, and his arm was around her, and the caption just said, "Finally warm enough." No mention of her name. Nothing that would flag to a casual follower. But there it was. I showed my nephew. He looked at both profiles for about 10 minutes, and then looked at me with an expression that said he didn't want to be the one to confirm what I was thinking. "That's the same woman, Uncle Miles," he said. "My name is Miles Crenshaw. I should have said that earlier. I went to the wine bar where Shanna worked. Not on the night she worked, on an off night, when I could talk to the bartender on duty without it being strange. I ordered a beer and made small talk, and eventually I mentioned that I'd heard good things about one of the staff there, a woman named Shanna, the bartender, a young guy who seemed bored and not particularly loyal to anyone's privacy, shrugged and said she was good at the job but had been cutting back her shifts lately. Her situation's changing, he said, in a way that clearly meant he knew she was engaged. That's nice, I said. Yeah, he said. She's had a good year. The last guy she was serious about didn't work out. That's too bad, I said. He said, and moved on to another customer. That told me Bryce was supposed to have not worked out, which meant the photos on his page were either old and mislabeled, or Shannon was not as done with him as she'd let everyone around her believe. I took 2 more weeks. I'm not proud of everything I did in those 2 weeks, but I'm not ashamed of it either. I drove past a wine bar on nights she closed. I sat in my car on the street for an hour at a time, which is the kind of thing that feels absurd when you're doing it. A 63-year-old retired engineer sitting in a Honda Pilot on a Tuesday night eating an apple and watching a bar entrance. But I stayed methodical. I kept a notepad, dates, times, what I saw. The third Tuesday, Bryce picked her up. White Ram 1500 Ohio plates, newer model. He was exactly as big and easy smiling as the photos suggested. She got in the passenger side and leaned over and kissed him before he'd even pulled away from the curb. I had the date, the time, and the plate number on my notepad before they turned the corner. The fourth Tuesday, same thing. I wasn't following them. I didn't need to. I had enough. What I had was this. My son was 3 months away from marrying a woman who had not ended the relationship she was in before she met him. That wasn't a hunch. That was documented fact. The harder question was what to do with it. Here's what I'd learned from the dinner, from watching them together, from every Sunday at my table, My son was deeply, genuinely in love with this woman. If I came to him with a notepad and a story about sitting outside a bar on Tuesday nights, he would not thank me. He would be angry, he would feel surveilled, and he would tell Shanna, and Shanna would have time to construct an explanation before I could say another word. I'd been around long enough to know that when someone skilled at manipulation gets advance warning, they don't panic. They prepare. I needed to be smarter than that. My retirement party was scheduled for the second Saturday in June. I'd worked for the same engineering firm for 22 years, and they were throwing me a proper send-off rented event space, open bar, 60 or 70 people from work, and from the neighborhood and from the years. My son was coming. Shanna was coming. I spent the 3 weeks before the party doing two things simultaneously. First, I confirmed what I already knew. I drove past the bar 2 more Tuesdays, saw Bryce's truck twice more, noted it down. Second, I found Bryce. That second part wasn't hard. His last name was on his Instagram, Bryce Keller, and he had a business page for a landscaping company he ran out of Central Ohio. I found his business phone number. I didn't call it yet. What I did instead was send him a message through Instagram. I kept it simple and I kept it honest. I told him my name. I told him I was the father of the man his girlfriend was currently engaged to marry in September. I told him I wasn't looking for a confrontation and I wasn't trying to blow up anyone's life. I told him that I had been watching his profile for several weeks and that the photos suggested he might not know about the engagement, and that if that was the case, he deserved to know. I sent it on a Wednesday morning and then I put my phone face down on the kitchen table and went for a walk. He responded that evening. He said, and I'm paraphrasing because I'm not going to quote a private message, he said that he didn't know about any engagement. He said they'd been together almost 2 years. He said he thought they were working towards something. We talked on the phone the next night. He was quiet and measured in a way that told me he was absorbing a shock and doing it with some dignity. I told him I wasn't trying to use him for anything. I told him he didn't owe me anything and that whatever he decided to do with this information was his business. But I also told him about the retirement party. I told him where it was and when. I told him that I was going to handle something at that party and that if he wanted to be there to see the truth in person, he was welcome. I told him I wasn't asking him to make a scene. I was offering him the chance to hear it from the source. He said he'd think about it. The morning of the party, I printed out 7 photographs. 6 of them were screenshots from Bryce's Instagram. The 7th was from a public photo a friend of his had posted of the 2 of them at a restaurant, dated 5 weeks before my son's engagement announcement. I put them in a manila envelope and put the envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket. I'd had the jacket tailored so it sat flat. The party was at a rented hall in Andersonville, a neighborhood my wife had loved. They'd done it up nicely. Round tables with white linens, a small stage at one end for speeches, a bar along the far wall. My son was there early, helping arrange name cards. Looking like himself, relaxed and good-humored, the version of him that exists before anyone's complicated his day. Sean arrived 20 minutes later in a dress that was slightly too formal for the occasion, the way you dress when you want to be noticed. The first 2 hours went fine. People said kind things about my work. My former boss told a story about a bridge project in 2009 that I hadn't thought about in years. I ate some of the past appetizers and shook a lot of hands and let myself feel, for a little while, like the evening was just what it appeared to be. Shanna found me near the bar during the dinner hour, when my son had gone to talk to some of my former colleagues across the room. She touched my elbow in a way that was meant to feel warm and only felt proprietary. Miles, she said, I've been meaning to talk to you about something. I waited. She lowered her voice, not because she was being discreet, but because she wanted it to feel like a confidence between us. Your house. I know we haven't discussed it directly, but with the wedding coming up and everything being so expensive, it would make a real difference to have a stable living situation from the start. Your neighborhood has great schools for when we have kids. I looked at her. I said, I appreciate you being direct with me. She took that as an opening. Her voice got a little firmer, the warmth dialing back. A house that size, on your own at your age, it's a lot of upkeep. We'd take good care of it, and it would stay in the family. It's my home, I said. My wife and I raised our son there. I won't be transferring it. Something moved across her face then, just briefly. Something that wasn't hurt feelings or surprise. It was calculation. Reassessment. She leaned in closer. Miles, she said quietly, you don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. We're going to be family. Don't put yourself on the wrong side of this. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, I need to check on something. And I took out my phone. I sent Bryce Keller a text. 3 words. We're at dinner. We'd arranged it beforehand. That was his signal that I was ready. He'd driven up that morning, 4 hours from central Ohio, and he'd been waiting at a diner 2 blocks away. Shanna watched me put my phone away. Who was that? She asked. Someone who wanted to be here tonight, I said. She studied my face and something in her expression shifted. Not panic. She wasn't the panicking kind, but awareness. She knew something had changed. She just didn't know what yet. I excused myself and found my son. I pulled him aside near the hallway that led to the restrooms, away from the noise, and I said, I need you to listen to me for about 3 minutes without saying anything. Can you do that? He looked at my face and he must have seen something in it because he just said, Okay, Dad. I opened a manila envelope. I set the 7 photographs on the small table between us, laid them out in order by date. He looked at the first one, then the second. He picked up the third and held it closer. This is recent? He asked. That one is from 5 weeks before you proposed, I said. He set it down. He looked at the rest of them without picking them up. His jaw was working, the way it does when he's controlling something. How long have you known? He asked. I've been certain for about 6 weeks, I said. Before that, I suspected. I didn't bring it to you until I was sure. He nodded once, slowly. Okay. There's one more thing, I said. At that moment, the main door to the hall opened. Bryce Keller walked in wearing a button-down shirt and an expression that said he'd spent the drive up here deciding he deserved to be in the room. He was carrying a small stack of printed messages. I didn't know about those until later. Texts between him and Shanna, the most recent from the previous Sunday. My son saw a stranger walk in and looked at me. That's Bryce, I said. My son is not a dramatic person. He closed his eyes for about 4 seconds. Then he opened them, and he straightened his jacket and he walked across the room. I followed. Shanna saw Bryce from across the hall before he saw her. I was watching her face. I saw the moment she understood. The color left her face so fast it looked like something physical had happened. She was standing near a table of my former co-workers, and she put one hand on the back of a chair, very slightly. Bryce stopped when he saw her. He looked at my son. Then he looked back at her. You want to explain the messages from last Sunday, he said. Not loud. Quiet, actually. That kind of quiet that carries. Shauna said his name. Just his name once. The table nearest them had gone silent. Then the table next to that one. My son looked at Shauna and he said, I'd like an explanation too. She tried. I'll give her that. She tried to find a version of the story that could hold. She said Bryce was an old friend. She said she hadn't been clear with him. She said things had been confusing after they ended. Her voice had lost its calibration. It was faster now, and a little higher than usual. Bryce took out his phone and read one of the messages aloud. I won't repeat it here. It was enough. It was more than enough. My son didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said, I want you to leave. She said, we should talk about this privately. He said, there's nothing to talk about. Please leave. She left. She walked across the room and picked up her purse from the back of her chair, and she walked out the main door without looking at anyone. 60 people watched her go. Bryce stood there for a moment. I shook his hand. I thanked him for making the drive. He nodded once, the way men do when they're maintaining themselves. And then he left too. The room was quiet for a few seconds. Then someone, one of my old colleagues from the firm, a woman who'd worked with me for 15 years and as a gift for normalizing awkward situations, said, well, Miles, that was one hell of a retirement gift. And enough people laughed that the room came back to itself. A little. My son and I sat in 2 chairs along the wall for a while. I handed him one of the past drinks that someone had set on a nearby table, and he took it without looking at it. You should have told me earlier, he said. Maybe, I said. I needed to be sure. He thought about that. Were you scared I wouldn't believe you? Yes, I said. He nodded. He turned the glass in his hand. I wouldn't have, he said. Not 6 weeks ago. He paused. Probably not 3 weeks ago. We sat there for another few minutes. The party had reconstituted itself around us. People talking, music resuming at low volume, someone telling another story at the bar. Life doing what it does. What did she say to you? He asked. Before. I saw her talking to you. I told him. I told him about the conversation at the bar, the request about the house, the part about not wanting to be on the wrong side. He was quiet for a moment. She'd been asking me about the house for 2 months, he said. Little questions, what I thought it was worth, whether you'd ever thought about a reverse mortgage. He shook his head. I thought she was just being practical. I know, I said. That's how it works. He looked at me then, really looked, the way he hasn't since he was small and something had frightened him. Thanks, Dad, he said, not elaborately, just that. That was enough for me. He did call off the engagement, formally, in a phone call the following week, which I thought showed more courtesy than she deserved. She sent him 2 long messages that I know about only because he told me. He said they were mostly about how I had manipulated the situation and poisoned his mind, and that he would regret it. He wrote back once, said he wished her well, and that was that. Bryce Keller texted me 6 weeks later. He said he appreciated what I'd done, even if the way it landed wasn't easy. He said he needed to know. I told him I was glad he made the drive, and that I hoped things were clearer for him now. He said they were. I don't know what he decided after that, and it's not my business. My son started dating again about 4 months later. He's more deliberate about it now. Less dazzled, more observant. He asks different questions on early dates, practical questions, the kind that reveal character over time. I don't take credit for that. He figured it out himself, but I think it helps that he knows his instincts can be checked against something steady, that there's someone paying attention from a different angle, who loves him enough to sit in a car on a Tuesday night with a notepad. That's not a romantic notion of fatherhood. It's the real one. Sometimes protecting someone means doing the unglamorous, uncomfortable thing over and over until you have something solid enough to stand on. It means risking their anger. It means trusting that the relationship is strong enough to survive the truth. Ours was. That's the part I'm most grateful for. The house is still mine. The sticky chairs are still in the den. My father's pocket watch is still in the display case in the hallway. And on Sundays, my son comes for dinner. That's the whole story. If something here felt familiar, if you watched someone you love get taken in by a person who saw them as a means to an end, I'd be glad to hear about it in the comments. And if you're in the middle of something like this and you're not sure what to do, sometimes the answer really is just be patient, be methodical, and wait until you're certain. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. There's always a next one. I've thought a lot about what would have happened if I'd done nothing. Not in a dark way, just practically. The way an engineer looks back at a structure that almost failed and tries to understand where the stress was concentrated. If I'd sat across from Shanna at that dinner table and told myself I was being paranoid, if I'd let the discomfort of the situation convince me to stay quiet, my son would have married her in September. He would have signed a lease on an apartment with her. He would have merged his finances with someone who was, at that same moment, texting Bryce from the parking lot of the wine bar. And eventually, maybe in 2 years, maybe in 5, it would have fallen apart in a way that couldn't be contained to a single evening at a party hall in Andersonville. That's what manipulation does when it goes unchecked. It doesn't stay small, it compounds. What I did wasn't heroic. I want to be clear about that. I sat in the car on Tuesday nights eating apples and writing things in a notepad. I sent a message to a stranger on the internet. I made a phone call. None of it felt decisive in the moment. It felt tedious and uncomfortable and, on more than one occasion, completely absurd. But I stayed with it because I knew what I'd seen, and I trusted what I knew, and I understood that the truth doesn't do anything useful if you leave it sitting in a notepad on your kitchen table. There's something I've come to believe, not from any particular book or teaching, but just from 63 years of watching how things actually unfold. The people who cause the most damage in other people's lives are rarely the loudest or the most obviously cruel. They're the ones who are patient about it, who calibrate, who know exactly how much warmth to perform and exactly when to dial it back. Shanna wasn't a monster. She was a person who had learned, at some point, that charm was a more efficient tool than honesty, and she'd gotten very good at using it. That's not a mystery. That's just what happens when someone optimizes for the wrong things long enough. What you do about it, though, that's where character shows up. My son is a good man, trusting, which I never want him to stop being entirely, because that quality in him is real and it comes from somewhere decent. But trust without discernment is just exposure. What I wanted for him, what I hope he has now, is the combination, the willingness to open up to people alongside the steadiness to pay attention over time. Those two things aren't in conflict. They just both have to be present. I'm not a perfect father. I've made my share of mistakes in that role, and my son could give you a list if you asked him on the right day. But I got this one right, and the way I got it right was not by being smarter than Shanna or luckier than my son. It was by being willing to do an unglamorous thing for a long time without any guarantee it would matter. That's most of what integrity actually looks like in practice, I think. Not the dramatic moment, the 40 minutes before it, and the 27 days before that, and the quiet decision at a kitchen table to not look away from something uncomfortable, just because looking at it is hard. My son comes for dinner on Sundays. That's the whole reward. That's enough.